Hey guys, it's Macias. I'm back again. Another video lecture for you guys. Now this one is going to go along with our new unit, the Enlightenment. All right, and this is going to be our main information for the Enlightenment and for especially the Enlightenment thinkers, the philosophers. Okay, so the dates, or at least the time frames we're looking at, 1600s to late 1700s. The Enlightenment was also called the Age of Reason. So if you want to get that subtitle in as a subtitle of the Enlightenment. As with all the video lectures, I will pause briefly in between clicking from slide to slide. I will also emphasize material and let you know when it's time to emphasize such material. Now, when we get to some of the videos in here, I will stop after the video to tell you which material to go back through and emphasize from the video. You won't have to take notes on the entire video, just on the things that I go back or that I tell you to go back and emphasize. Okay, so just some instructions as we start this new video lecture on the Enlightenment. One additional thing, this video lecture will be split up into two parts. This is a rather long lecture, so I'll be splitting it up into part 1 and part 2. Part 1 will take place the beginning of the Enlightenment through John Locke, and part 2 will take us from other thinkers all the way through the end of the Enlightenment. All right, and here we go. All right, so some background on the Enlightenment. We've gone over the Renaissance, 1300 to 1600, all that explosion of creativity and thought. After centuries of lost knowledge, the medieval age, dark ages, middle ages, medieval times, all synonyms for that same time period. Scientific revolution, 1500s to 1700s. This is just what we went over last week. The scientific revolution challenged old ways of thinking with new ways of thinking. Critical thinking was out, superstition was, critical thinking was in, and superstition was out. All right, starting, or at least continuing the background on the Enlightenment. Now, the thinkers and the educated peoples of the 1600s and 1700s, they certainly appreciated the works and accomplishments of guys like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, because these Enlightenment thinkers and other educated people were able to build on the foundations that these people started. All right, so just as Newton said, if he has accomplished anything, it's because he stood on the shoulders of giants. Now these Enlightenment thinkers and educated peoples get to say the same thing. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, now they were the giants that these new thinkers of a new age got to stand on top of to achieve their big accomplishments. Now, to come to their conclusions and to practice their own versions of the scientific method, one big thing that they used was reason and logic to figure out not only the natural world, but the world around them, the world of people. Now, reason and logic were also big-time ideas that the philosophers of the Greek age used. All right, so we still have some influences from Greece that carry on centuries and centuries later. And so with reason and logic, this is one thing that I want you to emphasize and make sure that for our avid friends, make sure you put an asterisk next to. For our non-avid friends, any other symbol, although you can use an asterisk as well. This definition of reason, all right, reason is limiting pure emotional thought and using more logic and critical thinking to find truth and solve problems. This is the kind of reason I'm talking about when later on when I talk about how the philosophers tried to figure things out. They used reason and logic. And through this reason and logic, ideas like intolerance and prejudice, as much as could be, they were out. And reflection and examination not only of oneself, but reflection and examination of the world around them, reflection and examination of people and governments was in. Now we'll do a viewing first of the video, and then I will tell you which items to emphasize, and then you'll go back, re-watch the video, and make sure you get those items of emphasis down.
The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, is the name given to an important period in the history of Western civilization that followed the Renaissance. The Enlightenment occurred roughly from the mid-1600s up through the end of the 1700s, and was a time when the human ability to reason was glorified. The word enlightenment means a time of illumination. The era was given this name because it was a time when an influential group of scholars, writers, artists, and scientists actively sought to use the clear light of reason, that is, rational thought, to rid the world of superstition and ignorance. As a result of their efforts, tremendous improvements in the understanding of mathematics and science occurred, and bold new ideas regarding basic human rights and democracy were developed that served as major inspirations to revolutionaries in both America and France.
Okay, so what bold new ideas were brought about, or at least were now starting to be thought of? Okay, so go back through the video. It's kind of towards the end of this little snippet, but what bold new ideas came about because of the Enlightenment? So make sure you get that down. So what was the Enlightenment? This is another item that you need to make sure that you emphasize, either with an asterisk or some other very visible means of emphasis for you. So the Enlightenment, and this is the working definition that we will use, not only for the purposes of this lecture, but what you will see probably on a quiz or test. So it was a European intellectual movement. Thinkers applied principles of reason and the scientific method to all aspects of society, including government, religion, economics, and education. Trying to get everything that humans more or less experience and apply reason and scientific method to trying to figure those out. Now, Enlightenment philosophers, they were also known as philosophs or new philosophers. They were thinkers who used logic and reason to find out how the natural world works and to better understand how people get along. Now, included in this idea of understanding how people get along, education, communication, people's rights, equality, politics, government, all of these institutions and all of these ideas were examined through the lenses of logic and reason, to try to come to rational explanations for how all this stuff works, how people interact, how they work with their government, how government works with them. These were brand new ways of looking at all of these ideas, rather than just relying on such things as divine right or superstition. Now, all of that stuff was on its way out. Critical thinking, rational thought, logic, those were in. Okay, again, we'll watch through the video. This one's a little bit longer. So you'll watch the video, and then at the end there will be a couple of items that I will have you emphasize, so you'll need to go back and make sure that you watch the video again and get those points of emphasis down in your notes.
Back when Carolus Linnaeus and Isaac Newton were making their great discoveries, people like them were known as natural philosophers. Today, they would be called scientists. Philosophers are people who seek wisdom or knowledge. During the Enlightenment, while natural philosophers sought to understand natural things, such as the motion of the planets, or the behavior of microscopic organisms. Other philosophers concentrated on the mind, political subjects, and other more abstract concepts as well. One of the most important philosophers to focus on political subjects was an Englishman named John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. Locke believed that the power of a government to rule must come from the consent of the governed. In other words, that people should be able to choose who governs them. Locke took comfort in England's glorious revolution of 1688, in which the king was forced to relinquish a large amount of his power to parliamentary representatives. He promoted the idea that every human being was born with three basic natural rights: those of life, political equality or liberty, and the ownership of property. Locke also promoted freedom of the press, educational reform, and religious tolerance, and called for the overthrow of governments that failed to protect basic human rights. In France, several great Enlightenment philosophers wrote passionately about human rights and democracy as well. French philosopher Voltaire, for example, championed the idea of freedom of speech with his famous statement, "I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." While another Frenchman, Montesquieu, called for a complete separation of powers to maintain balance in government, which was to be accomplished by creating separate legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Nearly all philosophers of the Enlightenment era wanted to see a strict separation of church and state as well, for they realized that mixing government and religion was almost always a recipe for disaster. The Enlightenment philosophers themselves were usually deists, people without traditional religious beliefs, who believed in what they called nature's God, that is, in an all-powerful spiritual force that had created the universe and everything in it, but then left it alone. The ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers were deeply admired by the leaders of both the American and French revolutions. In fact, Thomas Jefferson fell back on them time and time again when he was composing the Declaration of Independence, as did the framers of the United States Constitution when they worked out a plan of government for the new American democracy.
All right, so let me give you a few items that you'll need to go back and emphasize. So you'll want to write these items down, maybe phrase them as questions, and then when you go back through the video, then you can provide your answers, and make sure, again, you put those points of emphasis down. So first one, what are philosophers? What did the video say philosophers were? In other words, their definition. You can go ahead and pause the video as you need to make sure that you get down your question, each question as I say them now. Next one, what was the idea behind John Locke's consent of the governed? Okay, what was the idea behind John Locke's consent of the governed? Next one, besides life, liberty, and property, what were some of the other things that Locke championed? Okay, besides life, liberty, and property, what were the other items that Locke championed? Next one, what did almost all philosophers agree on regarding religion and government? What did almost all philosophers agree on regarding religion and government? Next one, which two revolutions did the Enlightenment influence? Which two religions did the Enlightenment influence? And then last one, which two American documents were influenced by the Enlightenment and philosoph thinkers? Which two American documents were influenced by the Enlightenment and the work of the philosophers, the thinkers? Okay, so now that you have these questions down, go back through the video and get your answers. Emphasize those. Definite quiz or test material. Okay, now we'll move on to the rest of the part 1 of this lecture. All right, so the first of the philosophers that we'll put under the microscope here is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was a British writer and thinker who felt that the world was pretty harsh, pretty rough place. People were selfish and wicked, and that they needed and craved safety. Okay, they wanted safety, and they were probably willing to give up some of their rights in order to achieve or attain that safety. He even went so far as to say that people must be willing to give up some of their rights to a strong ruler in exchange for that protection that the strong ruler can provide, even if that ruler was a tyrant. Now, this agreement between the people and whatever government was his idea of social contract. And he talked about these ideas and his version of the social contract in a book that he wrote called Leviathan. And there's an image of what Locke looked like. Next philosopher we'll take a look at, John Locke, another British guy. Now, he felt that people were definitely capable of learning from their experiences and improving themselves. Okay, on that point, he differed a little bit from Hobbes. Locke did not feel that people were inherently selfish and wicked. Okay, he felt that there were more redeeming qualities about people. He certainly liked the idea of self-government. In other words, the idea that people should be able to choose which government is going to rule over them. Okay, now this goes along with his ideas behind consent of the governed. People should be able to choose which government will rule over them, and even how that government will rule over them. He came up with what he called natural rights, which people were born with. All right, it wasn't within the power of a government to take away these rights. People are simply just born with them. No one can take them away. And those are the rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, he equated liberty with political equality, political freedom. All right, so I want you to emphasize that down. That he thought of liberty as political equality and political freedom. That was his idea of liberty. Now, moving on to that aforementioned consent of the governed. Government gets its power through the grace or permission of the people. Okay, so governments get their power from the consent of the governed. In other words, the people allow a government to rule over them. And if the government doesn't do its job, then the people have the right and even the obligation, in other words, the duty, to kick that government out and get a new one. Okay, try to think about that for a second. We go from all those forms of government we took a look at earlier, okay, monarchy, even constitutional monarchy, fascism, totalitarianism, in which the people, with the exception of constitutional monarchy, the people had very little power. Now, with Locke's ideas here, the people are all the power, and the government simply gets its power to govern from the permission of the people. So he was a fan of constitutional monarchy, especially with the idea that a monarch had to give up some of his power to a parliament, which represented the people. He loved that idea. And he also looked at it as an agreement between people and the government. Okay, so like another version of social contract. Although the two versions of social contract we'll concentrate on is Hobbes' version and a guy we'll take a look at in part 2 named Rousseau. Okay, but stick with Locke for now. He put his ideas forth, his ideas on government. He put them forth in a book that he wrote called Two Treatises on Government. All right, so Locke was, even more than Hobbes, Locke was a super influential guy on a lot of the ideas on government, particularly when it comes to consent of the governed, and even some of the wording that he used, such as life, liberty, property. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, would later use some of those words. He changed it up a little bit, but he would use some of those words in the Declaration of Independence. Instead of saying life, liberty, and property, he used life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because in the eyes of the founders of the United States, happiness pretty much meant one's ability to own property, which meant your ability towards success, your ability for prosperity. All right, happiness was property to Jefferson and the rest of the founders. So he was a big fan of John Locke. Jefferson was big fan of John Locke, and such a fan that he borrowed some of his language and put it in one of the most important documents in world history, the Declaration of Independence. There's a little bit clearer image of John Locke. Now, this will conclude part 1 of this lecture on the Enlightenment. We will get to part 2 next week when we take a look at the rest of the philosophers. Now, you will be also today you will be receiving an assignment on all of the philosophers, with the exception of Voltaire. Your notes will be the source of most of the information for Voltaire. The rest of the information you'll get in these biographical briefings that you are receiving. Okay, so make sure you guys get these down. Make sure you go back through, review your notes, underline, highlight important points, things that seem like they are important and need emphasis. Go back through and do your questions and your summaries. I will be checking on Monday to make sure that you did at least part 1 of this lecture. And it'll be the same thing as last time. It's an all or nothing thing. You either did it or you didn't. There is no late credit. So Monday, have those notes ready to go. We'll move on to part 2. All right, guys. Take care. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.